until about 10 years later, probably the mid-90s, that I curated a show at a museum called Inside Out, Psychological Self-Portraits. And along with that show, I had to write an essay about it. And what I did, I found myself writing a self-portrait. And found myself incredibly conflicted and uncomfortable about what I was disclosing in that essay, and thinking about patients and what I was disclosing. And I realized that a major change had gone on for me, aesthetically and internally, in terms of how I was going to operate with patients. And I realized that it really came out of the group. And that was that I was beginning to find that my most useful tool in terms of how I was going to work with patients was myself. And I was going to have to be the barometer. And I was going to have to make the determinations of what I was going to disclose, how I was going to disclose it, based on that barometric pressure. And you know, in that essay, what I wrote about was, as Art alluded to, the relationship between the isolation of the artist and the isolation of the analyst, and then the interrelationship between the artwork and the artist, and the patient and the analyst. And that's really a very important component to understand, is both our isolation and our connectedness. And that's one of the crucial lessons that I think over the course of 30 years with art that I have.
Here is the paradox of NPAP.
It is founded by Theodore Reich, listening with the third ear. I doubt if any class uses listening with the third ear as a textbook. However, he was the beginning of relationship therapy. He used his fantasies, his history, his rumblings as a way of working with people, to be still having a traditional framework. But one of the things that I have to confess, after I don't know how many years of supervising people, is that the focus of presentations, even though you remind them, is on the patient and not on a patient and therapist. And that there is the history of the patient, very clear. But where is the history of the therapist? In fact, I believe anybody who writes an article should put a short paragraph of their history so you know where their biases are. Because we choose a theory that reflects a little bit of our life story. Now, here is the real rub of all this. People shy away from being in the seminars that I give. And by the way, they are not countertransference seminars. They are therapeutic communities. Because frankly, there's much more that goes on than countertransference. Because therapists struggle with their loneliness, their personal things. It is not therapy, but it's humanity. And they have a right to be heard, and still we have a right to carry on the goal of working with cases. So it's that peculiar balance of presenting the clinical material, talking about how it impacts on you, And it's a trick because people say, well, this patient makes me feel that he is such and such and such and such. Because they have had a history at NPAP and most institutes where you talk about the patient, and it's hard to talk about yourself, particularly, by the way, if you're getting graded and the teacher's going to write down some evaluation. I think I once mentioned one director of education put counter-transference groups in the entire institute. It lasted 6 months. Everybody became paranoid. It didn't work. You gotta do this outside of an institutional structure where you're not going to be graded, because you do enough of your own grading as it is. There's enough humiliation and shame that's presented in your cases. So God forbid you should have a perverted fantasy about a patient. How do you bring this up? You censor it. How do you bring up deep unconscious stuff that comes out in the interaction? It's all part of the mix. Each person of the group is presenting their unconscious that has some contribution to what is going on. That's loaded. Or there can be, as usual, defenses, resistances, and what have you. But when it's working well, you are trying to understand how your insides impacted on the patient's insides and vice versa. Now, it just so happens that different schools emphasize different things. Like the relationship people, they like to always share everything. And from my point of view, you're missing sometimes what the issue is with the patient who has fears of intrusion, overstimulation, and what have you. But how to share what's going on in you with the patient becomes an art form. Since you don't blurt it out, but you transform it into empathy, but you say what's going on inside of you, so that if your eyes are closing, you don't say to a patient, "You're making me fall asleep," which comes out as an accusation. What you say to the patient is there something that I'm saying that's not interesting? And the patient looks at you. You're very interesting what you say, but I get distracted, so I must not be saying what's going on inside of me. Can you help me out in this? I don't know what you're talking about. But I am doing something that's in the neurological literature. I am stimulating mirror neurons. I am stimulating a kind of mirroring that has not been stimulated before, and playing with that. But I am not blurting out what's inside of me. Again, the art form is, how do you transform it into something that is empathetic and not bullshit? Now, it just so happens that empathy can be the biggest defense that an analyst could have. Because sometimes you gotta mirror. And people don't like to mirror. It exposes them too much. They like to interpret or empathize. Empathize, big thing. You could always, because most therapists got depressed mothers. And you learn that from your depressed mother, how to be very empathic and there for her. But sometimes you could be so there for the patient, you're not there for yourself. And if you're not there for yourself, how do you learn what's going on between the two people? Not that I'm de-emphasizing empathy, but like everything else, it is an organized defense that can start way back. And I believe this is the rationale for many people who are good listeners and good empathizers, but don't hear what's going on in their own drumbeat, and listening to it and using it. So that, you know, it's very interesting. Doug always brings a bottle of water to the meeting. And at a certain crucial point, he cracks the bottle. And you hear it crack. And I say to myself, he's communicating something. Something is cracking. And I say to myself, he's not saying what he's cracking. To this day, do you have any ideas what he's cracking?
It cracks around the same. It always cracks around the same time during the meeting, and I think it's really a kind of a pivotal moment towards the end. And there's no doubt that that there is a great deal. I think different times, different meanings, but a great deal of meaning. I think it's just as significant that the few times I haven't brought the bottle, you look at me and say, "What happened to the bottle? Where's the bottle? I missed the cracking." So, I want you all to understand, to notice, as you listen to Art talk about the way that he works and the way that he's taught generations to work, that that he's talking as an analyst, and yet he's not saying things that are typically defined as the classical kind of analytic things. There hasn't been any mention of things like frequency, for example. And I'm reminded of that because not too long into my stint with Art, when I was going up for case presentation, and I had intuited that I needed to bring my my evil twin double into that process. I had a patient who I was seeing 4 times a week, who was a control patient, and we were in the middle of the control. And because I wanted to be the great student, and I wanted a neurotic patient, I made all different kinds of Oedipal interventions with this patient. And basically what I was saying to her is, wouldn't you like to walk out the door and leave? Because I was absolutely not attending to myself and where my inner barometer was and how that was relating to the patient. And I was bringing a sense of my story, but the wrong part of my story to it. And it was a great lesson, because it was a lesson that informed me that only when I really assimilate my own insights, only when I assimilate theory and then forget it, will I really be an analyst. And that doesn't matter whether I'm seeing somebody once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times a week. I'm never going to be, once I do that, and once I integrate that, I'm never going to be anything in that treatment place except an analyst.
I'd actually like to ask some thoughts and some questions. I had a patient who was brain damaged and really couldn't articulate, just sort of have phrases. And she actually got better. One of the people that I used as a supervisor for that was Art. And I basically said, am I really doing something here that's actually working. We would sort of signal to each other, we would have an emotional tone. It was a very complicated case, oddly enough. And the happy news about it is that she was tested before and after 2 years of treatment, and it turned out her memory improved. It was testable. So art really helped me think about what analysis is. This is not analysis that uses language and a couch 5 times a week. And yet it was truly analysis, and it was something that worked. So I would like to ask Art a little bit about what is analysis and why does it work?
First of all, I don't care if it works. That is not my concern. My concern is that I'm there with the patient. I'm working on this relationship. And if something goes wrong, then, or where there's something that interferes with the flow, we deal with it. But it's very hard to prove something, of whether it works or not. It's like saying, what is art? Gold, I ask you, you know what art is?
Yeah, I know it when I see it.
Okay. Well, I know analysis when I see it too.
That's right.
I know when something is happening energetically and it's alive. I like to make the one thing about history, one comment about history. It's not only that you've got to be in touch with your history, but you have to make peace with it. You have to not only know it, but you have to know the opposites that hurt you, that made impact on you, so that you can integrate those opposites. It is easy to say, my mother was this, 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 and this. But can you also say, she was also this, this, and this? Can you put the positives and negatives together so you're not projecting one part out, which therapists are excellent in doing? It is the patient who is the borderline, not me. But I would propose that everybody in this office, in this room, has a piece of borderline in them. And we all even, at times, are a little crazy. It's how we contain it, how we hold on to it. But your history is the bridge to your own authenticity, because you put those pieces together and they've got to feel who you are. That doesn't mean you spill all over the patient, but they got to feel that your presence. At the same time, their history can restrict your ability as an analyst, because you also have to put that history aside. You cannot put the history aside, however, if indeed you have made peace with it. It's subtle. But in your history, if you are constantly trying to prove to your mom that you are a good person and you're going to take care of her, you may be doing it also as an analyst. And you can't put that part aside to you until you also learn something about the hate towards that mom. And put the hate and the love together so that you can move it aside. Well, that takes a lot of training, particularly if you've been wounded and hurt a lot, to make peace with that and to find something good in it. That's really quite a challenge. And yet, I believe it is the challenge of our own treatment. Doug was at many board meetings that I was at. And I finally reached my recognition. I can't function in a board. I cannot function in a board because I get too angry. And I get too angry because it touches my arrogance, my narcissism. I think I know better than everybody else. And I haven't been able to contain that. And you know what? All the others are doing the same thing. So we're all a little crazy at times. I could never go to sleep after a board meeting. So that I said, this is not for me. I have to admit, and here is the other part of one of my theses. I think that when we have arrived, we know where we belong. We know what group or what community best reflects us. And that pathology is sometimes ending up in a place that doesn't mirror who we are. So we're constantly at odds with that community, and sooner or later, we either submit to that community or we're very alone. So my wife and I buy a house in Huntington, and in 1 month we get rid of it. Huntington was not our province. And we said, let's get out before we become Huntington. And we got out. Thank God we went back to New York. I put on my jacket and tie, and I found 3 apartments